In this lesson, I'll give you an overview of some of the essential functions in Corel Painter, such as choosing brushes and selecting color. Let's start by experimenting with some of the brushes. Up in the top left is the brush selector, and if we click on that, we can open the brush selector. On the left, we have the brush categories. These are the various types of brushes. Over on the right, we have the brush variants, and these are the different types of brushes within each category. So for example, I'll select acrylics and oils, and you can see these are all the different types of acrylic and oil brushes. You can feel free to just select and experiment with some of these brushes. Go ahead and paint with this one here. That was broad cover brush. Let's try clumpy brush. You can see it looks different. And we'll try one more. Let's try dry bristle. As you can see, they all three share kind of a painterly characteristic. I'll clear that out. Let's open the brush selector. We can also customize the brush selector, and we can make it wider or taller, and we can show more than one column of brushes. And then each time you open the brush selector, you'll be able to see it in that view. Selecting a brush and applying it to the canvas is really the best way to get a feel for how a brush is going to perform. But you can also get a quick overview of the characteristics of a brush using the stroke dab and the stroke preview. The stroke dab is the tip of your brush or tool, and it shows where the brush is going to make contact with the canvas. For example, this glazing round brush has a bunch of little speckles or bristles. So if I paint with that, you can see those little bristles or speckles in the brush stroke. If I select a brush with a different dab type, such as opaque detail brush, then you can see that this looks more like a pen. But if I make my brush much larger and I just do a dab, you can see that the paint is more concentrated in the middle, and then it feathers out to be more transparent near the edges. These are just the dab shapes found in this particular category, but if we look in other categories, there are rendered dab shapes and particles and all kinds of different shapes you can get out of your brush tip. We'll go back to acrylics and oils. Another way to get some information about your brush is to look at the stroke preview. And the stroke preview basically just takes a dab and it repeats it along a path to create a stroke. If I select clumpy brush and I paint a stroke with that, you can see that this dab simply overlaps itself to create the illusion of a continuous stroke. In addition to showing a preview of what the stroke will look like, you can also see some of the brush properties. For example, this yellow-orange color shows you how quickly the brush will run out of paint when you create a stroke. The color represents resaturation or paint loading, and the white represents blending or transparency where the brush runs out of paint. So with clumpy brush, if I paint a stroke, you can see that eventually it does run out of paint if I create a really long stroke. If a stroke preview doesn't have any of that yellow-orange color, then it's not going to naturally blend or fade to transparency. Broad cover brush, as you can see, does not behave in the same way. In the case of opaque smooth brush, you can also see some tapering on the ends of the strokes, which indicates that this brush is going to respond to pen pressure, which will change the brush size. You may also find that some brushes can vary in opacity along the stroke as well. So with opaque smooth brush, I can press lightly or firmly to change the size of my dab. This isn't going to be a super in-depth course on all the different dab types. For that level of detail, I recommend that you check out the full version of my course for Corel Painter 2021. I go really in-depth into all the dab types, stroke types, and properties, and you can really learn a lot even if you're only using Corel Painter Essentials. Feel free to go through this list and check out all the different dab and stroke types that you can get. This will give you a really good overview of what you can do with Corel Painter without having to try every single brush. I'm going to continue using opaque smooth brush, and let's take a look at the brush cursor. In order to see the brush cursor more easily, I'm going to select black, and I'm going to press Ctrl F on my keyboard to fill my canvas with black. The circle that's surrounding the tip of my pen is my brush cursor, and if I select kind of a light gray, and I paint a stroke using my heaviest pressure, you can see that that cursor represents the maximum size of my brush. Another thing you'll notice if you make a stroke is that that cursor disappears as soon as I start painting on the canvas. When you change your brush size, that cursor is going to get smaller or larger. As you can see, I'm going up here to the properties bar to the size menu, and I'm changing the brush size. Now there is a better way to change your brush size. Rather than going up to the properties bar, you can hold Ctrl and Alt on your keyboard, and then tap and drag with your pen or click with your mouse, and you can visually set the diameter of your brush. So if I want it to be this big, I'll let go of Ctrl and Alt, lift my pen up. Now I have a brush that's that wide. If I want it to be really big or really small, then I can do that really easily. However, if you do want a very specific brush size, let's say you're doing line art and you always want your brush to be 3 pixels wide, then you can set your size numerically there. And just so I can keep my canvas black while drawing on it, I'm going to create a new layer, and I'll just be painting on that layer. In addition to changing the brush size, you can also change the brush opacity. So I'll make a fully opaque stroke, and then I'll lower the opacity, let's say to 50, make another stroke, lower it to 10, and make another stroke. We'll go all the way down to 1. And now you can barely see it at all. In fact, I have to build it up several times just to get it to even show up. And you can see that as you continue to make strokes, the opacity increases until finally it reaches 100%. Setting the opacity to 0 means that no paint will apply to the canvas no matter how many strokes you make. So if you want the brush to kind of fade in gently, you'll want to set opacity lower. Or if you want it to be really strong and really opaque and cover everything, then you can set opacity higher. Hovering over one of these properties will also give you a tooltip that'll help you see what that property is going to do. I'm going to change my brush category to airbrushes, and I'll choose Digital Soft Pressure Airbrush. Pen pressure is linked to opacity for this brush. So if I make a really big brush and then go from heavy pressure to really, really light pressure, then you can see that I can taper off my opacity just by pressing more lightly with my pen. This works really well to create an interesting sky effect. If you want to just create a nice hand-painted gradient like so, you can choose colors that are lighter or darker and just fade them out like so. New in Corel Painter Essentials 8, you can now utilize brush, tilt, and bearing if your tablet supports it. I'm going to select a different brush. Let's go to Pencils, and we'll choose Soft 2B. Now if I make a really big brush here, as I tilt my pen, the size of that cursor elongates, and it makes the brush flat. If I make it more upright, then it compresses together. It's very much like if you're drawing with a real pencil and you draw with the side of your pencil lead rather than your pencil tip. So I'll make this brush quite a bit smaller, and I'll start by drawing a circle with the pen upright, and then I'll tilt it, and I can really, really intuitively and easily shade using the side of the pencil. And this is some of the best tilt support there is. And of course, if you wanted to, you can rotate your canvas, get to more comfortable angles there, and shade this however you like. Not all brushes can support pen tilt, but the ones you would expect to should. That would be primarily pencils and other types of hard media. Let's take a look at another type of brush. We'll choose airbrushes, and we'll do coarse spray jitter. If I keep this pen upright and I paint a stroke, you can see I get this really nice spray effect. But if I tilt my pen, now I'm able to change the direction that I'm spraying out those little droplets of paint. It's very much like a natural airbrush. This is the bearing property where Corel Painter is detecting not just the tilt of your pen, but also the direction that it's facing, whether it's north, south, east, or west. Brushes that can use bearing are typically going to be spray brushes, so if you see spray in the name of the brush, you know it's probably going to be able to use bearing. Let's go back to the brush selector. Because there are so many brushes here in Corel Painter, it can be a little bit intimidating to find a brush to paint with. You might also feel limited by the categories, like you can only paint with acrylics and oils to create an acrylic and oil painting, but that's not necessarily true. This is digital painting, so you can mix acrylics and oils with watercolor, and then you can put chalk on top of that. A brush is really just a look. So when I'm choosing brushes, I don't think about the category, unless of course I'm trying to make something that looks like an oil painting. I just look at the shape of the brush, select a brush like this variable flat, and I paint a stroke with it. I might try different types of strokes, little short strokes, I might dab with it, and I might find that when I dab with it, I find something that maybe will work well for doing trees. Initially, you wouldn't think that this is a very good tree brush, but if I tilt my pen, I can change the angle of the dab, and I could create something that looks like a bush. Now, of course, I'd want to choose a color like green, and then put some highlights over it, and so on. So rather than think of this as an acrylics and oils variable flat brush, this is my tree brush. Or maybe it's my grass brush if I use it like this, where it's more flat. And then as I mentioned, you're not limited to using just acrylics and oils. If I want to choose a chalk, pastels, and crayon, and take some chalk, select a brown color, and put some dirt over that, I can do that as well. You're also not limited to using the default brushes. You can customize all these brushes. When you change the opacity or the grain or other properties, you're able to get a lot more looks out of that brush. For example, right now the grain is set to 12. Grain is that nice texture we're getting from the paper. If I want to increase that to 100% and just create a flatter brush that covers a lot more, I could do that. Or I could set the grain really low. And if I just want a simple texture brush that just spits out a few little speckles of color, I could do that. Might make that a bit higher. And there you go. You can see that it takes a lot of effort to build that up, and it never builds up to full opacity. Now let's move on to something that you'll be doing a lot here in Corel Painter Essentials, which is choosing color. Choosing color is as easy as clicking here on the color picker. If we take a look at the anatomy of the color picker, we have this ring, which is the hue ring, and you use this to choose a pure color, such as yellow, blue, red, or green. Within that ring is the triangle, which has value or brightness or darkness on the vertical axis, and saturation, which is the color intensity, on the horizontal axis. So if a color is more saturated, it's more vibrant. If it's less saturated, then it's more muted or pastel. By clicking anywhere in this triangle, you can choose the color that you want. When I'm choosing color, I like to use a 3-step process. First, I choose the hue of the color. So if I'm going to paint a sky, for example, I know that a sky is blue, so I'll choose something right around here. And then I'll decide whether or not I want that sky to be bright or dark. If I want it to be bright, I'll go up. If I want it to be dark, I'll go down. So I know I want it to be pretty bright since it's going to be a daytime sky. And then do I want the sky to be vibrant, or do I want it to be kind of overcast and more muted? Let's say I want it to be more bright and vibrant. I can do Control F to fill my canvas with that bright blue color. I'll zoom out a bit here. I'm going to switch to a brush in the airbrushes category called Digital Soft Pressure. Then I'm going to shift my hue a bit toward indigo and make my color a bit darker. Make a big brush and just kind of fade this down to create a really nice sky effect. I could choose a lighter, more cyan blue and brighten it up. Put in some of that at the bottom and fade it up. And that's how you could choose colors for a sky. There's a lot more that we can do with color, but we'll come back to that a little bit later in this lesson. I'm going to create a new layer by clicking down here at the bottom of the layers palette. And I'll select white. And I'm going to choose a different brush. Let's choose Acrylics and Oils, Real Oils Filbert. And I'll just put in some cloudy shapes like this. If you make a brush stroke that you don't like, rather than erase it, you can undo it. You can go to Edit, Undo, or press Ctrl Z. And each time you press Ctrl Z, you will go back a brush stroke. You can do this up to your undo limit, which is 32. If you want to bring a brush stroke back, you can go to Edit, Redo Brush Stroke, or press Ctrl Y, and you'll go all the way back to your most recent brush stroke. You can set Undo and Redo to an express key if you like. I recommend not relying too much on undo because you should be doing rather than undoing, otherwise you're never going to get any painting done. You can go to Edit Preferences, and then if you look under Performance, here's where you can set your undo levels. I like to set mine to 9. Not only can this improve performance, but it also keeps you moving forward rather than constantly undoing. As it says here, you can set the undo levels all the way up to 256, but then your computer has to remember all of those brush strokes, which can impact performance. We'll come back to the rest of these preferences later. If you want a more traditional way to remove paint, you can select the Eraser tool. The Eraser tool works just like the brush tool, except it removes paint rather than adding it. As you can see, it responds to pen pressure, and I can even change some of the properties. I can give the brush a harder edge, or I can make it softer. I can change the size and the opacity. I'll set my opacity to around 10. One thing to note with these sliders is you can hold down Control to make the slider move more slowly. So I'll dial that into 10. I'll make a bigger brush, and I'll just fade out the bottom of this a bit. What I'm doing is erasing. It looks kind of like I'm blending in blue, but I'm actually just turning some of those pixels semi-transparent. You'll be able to see that if I hide this background layer and the canvas. In addition to using the eraser tool, you can also flip your pen over and use the eraser if your pen has an eraser on the end. This will basically just load the eraser tool, and you'll get the exact same eraser settings that you chose before. One of the advantages to using the eraser end is that you can erase with this end. You can flip the pen over, and with the brush tool selected, you can paint. That makes it really quick to switch back and forth. You don't have to click on anything. It also keeps your nib from wearing down, because if you're using your pen tip to erase, that's just more friction that you're putting on it. So if you're erasing a lot, do it with your eraser end. Another cool thing that you can do with the eraser end of your pen here in Corel Painter is you can select an entirely different brush. So with the eraser end, I'm going to select a blender like directional diffuser, make a big brush, and you can see that I can blend this stuff. If I flip my pen back over, then I'm going back to Real Oils Filbert, which was my previously selected brush. So I can paint with one end, and I can blend with the other. This is really cool. If you have any sort of brush that doesn't really rely on accuracy, then you can use this eraser end to paint with it. Again, that keeps your nib from wearing down too quickly. It's also worth mentioning that the eraser end does support pen pressure. So for example, I can use heavier pressure or lighter pressure with the eraser end. So it is actually pretty accurate, and you can draw with it just fine. Another way that you can quickly switch between brushes is to use recent brushes. This is found in the brush, and this will show you the last 10 brushes you selected. You can also pop this panel out by going to the window menu and choosing recent brushes. We'll go ahead and add that to our workspace and save it as our layout. I'll just give it the same name to override it. And now I can select a bunch of different brushes. Let's say we'll use this chalk brush. You actually have to apply the brush to the canvas in order for it to enter that list of recent brushes. And now you can see I can go back and forth between Real Oil Filbert and Clouds and all of the other brushes that I've selected. I'm going to open the sampling template to demonstrate with. If you've purchased the downloadable version of this course, then it's included in the resource files folder. And let's take a look at the color sampling tool, also known as the dropper. The keyboard shortcut for this is D, but you can also invoke it at any time with the brush tool selected by holding down Alt on your keyboard. Now when I hold down Alt and I click, it's going to sample a color. So in my color picker, whichever color I click on here is chosen as the color that I'll paint with. So if I go ahead and paint with smooth pen, you can see I'm painting with green, or if I sample yellow, I can paint with yellow, and I can really quickly and easily get the color that I want off of my canvas. This can be useful for keeping your colors consistent. One thing about the dropper tool is if you're clicking on a very complex background with a lot of different colors, it may be difficult to get the color that you want. As you can see, I'm clicking in this really small area here, and there's so many different pixels of different colors that I'm getting a different color every time. So if I wanted mostly this green color, it might be kind of hard to get. There is a really precise cursor that I can use though, so if I just try to get the color within that cursor, that's the color I'll get. One thing to keep in mind with the dropper tool is if you were to add layers of tinting over your artwork, that's going to affect the color that you get when you sample colors. So for example, if I sample over here on this value scale, all those colors are going to have that yellow cast to them because I added a yellow tinting layer over everything. So if for some reason I hid that tinting layer and I started painting again, it's going to appear to be a cream color. So if you have tinting layers like this, just make sure to hide them if you're going to be sampling and painting with the colors that are underneath. I'm going to return to my demonstration canvas. I'll just clear out these demonstration layers and create another new layer. Let's double click on our color set to show that. I'll go ahead and expand it to make it much larger. The color set is kind of like your tubes of paint or your different colored pencils or crayons. They're just preset colors that you can choose from. So if you wanted a blue like ultramarine, or you wanted a cerulean blue, or a permanent green, you can get those, and they have those familiar names from traditional media. New in Corel Painter Essentials 8, there are also grayscale swatches, flesh tones, and pastels. This makes it really quick and easy to select a color. Aside from the grayscale, I don't really tend to select color using the color sets, but I do use them to choose my own color swatches, and they're especially useful with Harmonies, which we'll look at next. So for example's sake, we'll select our permanent green, we'll paint some on the canvas here, and let's open up our Harmonies. I'm going to make color sets quite a bit smaller. Harmonies is new in Corel Painter Essentials 8, and what it does is it offers you some scientifically harmonious color options. So if you're ever wondering what color is going to go good with permanent green, here's your answer. Any of these colors here. You have 3 different modes: complementary, monochromatic light, and monochromatic dark. If we look up at the color wheel, you can see this green color is opposite to this magenta color, and you can see that represented here. So any color that's across from another color on the color wheel is directly complementary to it. I won't go too in-depth into color theory in this video, but I do have some reference videos you can watch if you want to learn more. So a practical way I might use this is to draw maybe something like a stem for a flower. And then before I choose one of these colors to paint with one of my complementary colors, I want to first click on the lock to lock the base color. Otherwise, I'm going to click on this color and it's going to think that that's my base color. So now I can click here on this magenta color, can put in some of that. We'll just do a quick little doodle of something here. If we want to put some highlights on that, we can select a brighter color, put that in, and so on. Now the other modes are monochromatic light and dark. So for example, if we wanted to make that magenta color brighter, we can brighten it or we can darken it very easily. This makes it really easy to select colors. You don't have to go up here to the color wheel, you can just quickly get all kinds of different values. So I think Harmonies is really useful to have open. Now you may notice that Harmonies shares some similarities to the color sets. That's because in the full version of Corel Painter, you can actually export your Harmonies to color sets. And so that's typically how I would use color sets. Unfortunately, you can't do this in Corel Painter Essentials 8, but I just thought I'd mention that. I will also mention that some of these panels can be customized. For example, the color set panel can be made to show the icon smaller or larger. There's also options here for the color set libraries to show and hide the various color libraries. So I could hide that default library or show it again. I'm going to go ahead and just collapse Harmonies here. Another way to choose color is to use the mixer pad. The mixer pad is very much like a traditional artist's palette. You have the paint that's been applied to the palette, and then you have different blobs of paint so you can add more to the palette. For example, I could select this blue, select apply color for my tool, then I could apply some paint here. Then if I wanted to sample that color, I click the sample button and I can sample that blue. You can see it shown here in the color picker, or I could sample the red or the darker red and so on. You can also change your brush size to change the size of the paint that you apply. So I could make my brush much larger and apply a larger blob of yellow, make it smaller and apply a smaller blob of black. You can restore the mixer pad to clear that out and restore the default, or you can even clear it entirely so you can start fresh and just apply whatever you want to the canvas. You can even mix the colors together like so. When you sample a color, then you can very easily paint with it on the canvas. I'm going to select the layer adjuster tool and I'm just going to move this up and maybe even crop it down. I'll explain how to use these tools a little bit later. I don't know why you'd want to save something this hideous, but let's say we want to save this masterpiece. To do that, we'll go to File and we can choose from Save or Save As. I prefer Save As. We'll want to name this just like you'd name any ordinary file. I recommend creating a master folder for all of your artwork, that way you know exactly where to find your paintings. Then you can create subfolders based on the year that you made the artwork, or you could sort it alphabetically, or really however you like. The important thing is that you save things in places where you can find them. I'm going to give this a name. Let's call this Flower, and you can choose from some various file formats. There's the Painter Riff file format, which will save all of the proprietary Corel Painter features. When in doubt, just save it as a Painter Riff. If you save as any other file format, then you may find that things will change a bit. If you like to work between other applications, then you can use the Photoshop PSD file format or TIFF. That will preserve your layers and allow you to bring your artwork into different applications. PNG, JPEG, GIF, and Windows Bitmap are all going to flatten your image to a single layer. PNG supports background transparency, the rest do not. I recommend saving your master copy as a Painter Riff or possibly a Photoshop PSD. And then if you're going to be printing this or posting it to the web, make copies of your artwork. TIFF is a good format for printing, and PNG and JPEG are good formats for posting to the web. I prefer PNG, but JPEG will give you a smaller file size at the expense of making the image quality a little bit lower. I'll just save this as a riff, and now my artwork has been saved. If you don't save your artwork and then you close Corel Painter, that artwork will be gone permanently, so always be sure to save your artwork. You have to be careful with saving too, because you could save over something that you didn't mean to save over. That's why I prefer Save As, because it gives you a chance to think about what you're doing before you do it. Let's say I start painting, but it accidentally ends up on the canvas instead of the layer that I wanted it to be on, and I go to Save. Now I've permanently saved that, and if I didn't mean to do that and I find out later that that was a mistake, it's baked into my painting. The better way to do it is to make a change, and then go to File, Save As. Save your artwork as Flower 2, Flower 3, Flower 4, and so on. That way, if somewhere along the line you make a mistake, you can always go back to an older version without that mistake rather than having to start over from the beginning. This is known as iterative saving, and it's something I do a lot. It's not unusual for me to have anywhere between 20 and 60 different iterations of a painting. And you don't have to keep all those files, they do take up space. When you're done with them, you can delete them. But it is nice to use them to go through and see your progress. If you're interested in learning more about file organization principles, I have some reference videos you can watch on that subject. That brings us to the end of this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to take a more in-depth look at the tools in the toolbox. That's coming up next.